there's a reason for classified material. I just say I was not convinced that we shouldn't take the action that we're going to take this afternoon.
What do you think of Secretary Pompeo's argument publicly that we need to stay close to Saudi Arabia to deter Iran?
I think, I mean, I'm all for realpolitik, but that suggests that you accept the truth. And I think we all know what the truth is, that if he wasn't directly involved, he certainly knew of it, and the intelligence agents that we are sanctioning, that we are saying were involved, are under his direction. So that seems pretty clear.
Senator, Jamal Khashoggi's murder was not addressed in either Secretary Mattis or Pompeo's opening statement. Was it addressed at length during the briefing?
It's a classified briefing.
Senator, how do you feel about your Mueller resolution?
Mueller resolution?
What are your chances today?
Chris Coons and I and Senator Booker will be reintroducing a unanimous consent request to bring the Mueller resolution to the floor.
Do you think you have the votes to do it?
I believe so, but I believe it will be blocked. This takes unanimous consent, and I'm told that somebody will block it. So my commitment to not vote for judges before the committee or on the floor until we get this done stands.
Thank you, Senator. Are you concerned that the president is not?
All right, so you just heard from Senator Jeff Flake, and I know our Nancy Cordes is there along with some of our Capitol Hill producers. We're going to try to raise a couple of them on the phone to talk about what we are seeing right now, which is a number of senators are making their way to that microphone in anticipation of a briefing from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. You could hear the frustration there in Senator Jeff Flake's voice. Let's see who this is. All right, Robert Menendez in New Jersey. Let's listen.
That not having Gina Haspel, the CIA director, at this briefing is a cover-up to a critical question that the members of the Senate have as to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and a critical element of U.S.-Saudi relationships. It's outrageous that the Senate can be stonewalled from hearing from the CIA director. I have respect for the Secretary of State and Defense, but I don't need them to characterize the information of the CIA and the intelligence community. I need to hear it directly. It tells me volumes about what really is going on here. Secondly, I heard nothing convincing as it relates to why we should not proceed with the Sanders-Lee and others resolution. I did not support it originally, because I wanted to give the administration and the Department of Defense an opportunity to show me that our efforts were actually making a difference in the humanitarian catastrophe that is Yemen. Since then, all I have seen is the bombing of a school bus full of children, a series of other civilian targets bombed. That is not something that I want the United States involved with, and so I'll support the Sanders-Lee resolution. I hope others will as well. It's time to send Saudi Arabia a message, both on its violation of human rights and the incredible humanitarian catastrophe it is creating in Yemen.
Why do you think the administration didn't send Gina Haspel up here?
Because Gina Haspel, if all of the accounts are true, would have said with a high degree of confidence that, in fact, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia was involved in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, a United States permanent resident and a journalist. And it is outrageous that we are willing to turn our eye away from such a murder because we have quote-unquote interests. The interests that we have with Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia is going to still have those interests. They have a continuing challenge with Iran. They have a continuing challenge with extremism and those who are involved in international terrorism. That's not going to go away for the Saudis. They're still going to need the United States in that regard. But when we do not send a message to a country like Saudi Arabia, we tell an ally you can kill with impunity simply because you have some other interest with us, then we send a global message that is frightening and one that does not serve U.S. national interests and national security.
Thank you, guys. Thanks.
Senator, coming through.
All right, so while we keep an eye, let's keep an eye on that microphone, because it appears that many senators are just making their way one by one to that microphone in anticipation of the comments that will be made by the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. You just saw Senator Menendez from New Jersey, and a number of senators are approaching that microphone and saying that whereas in the past couple of days they were reluctant to support the resolution being put forth by Senators Sanders and Senators Lee. They are now in support of it. And essentially, if you're not up to speed on what that is, the Senate plans on invoking the War Powers Resolution. The War Powers Resolution is a federal law that was enacted in 1973 in an attempt to check the president's power, the president's ability to commit the United States to any kind of armed conflict without the consent of the United States Congress. And up until this moment, they have not chosen to do that, feeling that the U.S.-Saudi relations were more important than this. But that is changing. Let's hear Senator Durbin from Illinois.
Empty chair. A chair that should have been occupied by Gina Haspel, the head of the Central Intelligence Agency. We were told in this briefing that it was the direction of the White House that she not attend. I cannot recall a briefing on such a sensitive measure where we have been denied access to the intelligence agencies of the United States. As a consequence, much of the testimony was interesting but not persuasive. There are many of us who believe that this execution of Khashoggi in Istanbul could never have taken place without the knowledge and direction of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. That is a fact which this administration has never been willing to acknowledge, and we are asked to accept at face value that this sort of murder took place without his knowledge. I don't accept it.
Senator, you were explicitly told that the White House blocked Gina Haspel from coming to this meeting.
We asked why Gina Haspel wasn't there, and the two who were there said that was a decision of the White House.
Did Mattis and Pompeo answer any questions about the Khashoggi killing?
They did. They talked about their impressions, having read the intelligence. I can't go beyond that and be any more specific.
What do you think about their argument about that the greater, even though Saudi Arabia, sometimes you have to deal with people, unscrupulous characters, to be able to accomplish like greater goals like with Iran or counter? How did you feel about their argument about that?
It was interesting but not persuasive. As far as I'm concerned, even allies of the United States need to be held to standards of values and principles that we in the United States embrace. This wanton killing of an American resident, a Saudi citizen, in Istanbul cannot be ignored or overlooked. And the fact that we cannot or will not pursue this to its obvious end is frustrating to all of us.
Is it possible to work with Saudi Arabia and punish them at the
Well,
same
certainly
time?
if they acknowledge that they've made several grievous errors when it comes to diplomacy, the idea of Hariri from Lebanon being detained, the action taken against Qatar, there's a long list. Our allies aren't always perfect in our eyes. We can work with them as long as they're honest in the relationship. There's no honesty in the relationship when it comes to the Khashoggi merger.
So there you just heard from Senator Durbin. So far, it's been Democrats, except for Senator Flake, that have made their way to that microphone. But you've been hearing all along over the past couple of weeks, since the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, a bipartisan effort. And as I was saying before Senator Durbin took to that microphone, this measure is expected to invoke the War Powers Resolution, and that's likely to take place sometime this week. And this is sort of breaking with a longstanding tradition in the United States Congress, in the United States government, to prioritize the U.S.-Saudi alliance overlooking documented human rights violations by the Saudis. That's happened repeatedly over the last 15 or 20 years. The United States has looked the other way because of the importance of weapons sales and other military ventures between the two countries, including the war on terror, in using the Saudi as our ally to help win the war on terror. But now what you're seeing are bipartisan efforts by many senators to invoke this War Resolutions Act, which is used to check the president's ability to commit war without the authorization of Congress. And Senator Bernie Sanders has been calling for that. You've seen Senator Jeff Flake, he's a Republican, although he's on his way out of office, suggesting that he is going to support that resolution. And what you're hearing from all of these senators is the astonishment that the CIA Director Gina Haspel was not permitted by the White House to attend this briefing. And they are, as you can see and hear from the comments being made, extremely angry. Let's listen.
They did not disagree with the reports regarding the intelligence committee's assessments.
I don't think the Republican administration won any votes in this briefing. They did not deny that the civilian casualties have gotten worse, not better, since the Trump administration doubled down on our support for the Yemen civil war. They did not disagree with reports, public reports, that the intelligence communities believe that Mohammed bin Salman was involved in the death of Jamal Khashoggi. Their entire argument seems to rest on the effect that this resolution may have on negotiations that are happening between the Houthis and the Saudi-backed government a month from now. The fact of the matter is that this resolution, if it passes, will help get those negotiations to the finish line. So long as the United States is seen as an unconditional supporter of the Saudis, those negotiations will not succeed. If the United States is seen by the Houthis and by the Saudis as a true, honest broker in the negotiations have a better chance of succeeding. It was not a persuasive briefing. I don't know where the votes are right now. I think it's very fluid, but I think it's more likely today, it's more likely now than it was a few hours ago that we'll have the votes to survive a tabling motion.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator. Thank you.
All right, Senator Chris Murphy there of Connecticut. Again, you're hearing anger, frustration from the senators as they come out of this briefing by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Jim Mattis. Again, the frustration that the CIA Director Gina Haspel was not there to brief these senators as to what her findings, what her agency's findings are. But what you're hearing from a lot of senators is they are convinced more than ever that Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, was responsible, directly responsible for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. At one point, I forget which senator said this, it may have been Menendez, but one of them said, it's clear that these agents that are being charged in Saudi Arabia were under the direction of Mohammed bin Salman. So it doesn't matter that the Saudis have put forth these agents who they say is responsible for the murder of Khashoggi. They say that Mohammed bin Salman is directly responsible, as those agents were under his direction. So that's the frustration that you're starting to hear from the senators. Hopefully there will be a few more Republicans who will approach those microphones to give us their sense. We've already heard from Senator Jeff Flake. Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee has also been on the record as to expressing his frustration with the Saudis. But both of those senators are not going to be around in January. And so it'd be interesting to hear from some others. But we've seen increasing bipartisan agreement amongst senators that something needs to be done. And this resolution now that even some Democrats were not on board with up until even today, some Democrats were not on board with the resolution. Here's Bernie Sanders. He's the one who put forth the resolution. Let's listen.
Right now in Yemen, we are seeing the worst humanitarian crisis on earth. We have already seen 85,000 children starve to death. The United Nations tells us that millions of people are facing starvation. 10,000 new cholera cases are developing every single week because there is no clean drinking water there in that country. And all of that was caused by the Saudi-led invasion of Yemen 3 years ago, led by a despotic, dishonest dictatorship. And to my mind, it is imperative today that the United States Senate tell Saudi Arabia and tell the world that we are not going to be continuing to be part of that humanitarian disaster. We are ending our participation in that horrific war, and that we are going to do everything that we can to force the Saudis and the Houthis to the peace table and to provide the desperately needed humanitarian aid that Yemen requires.
Senator, was there any credibility to the administration's argument in your mind that by Americans pulling out, we make the humanitarian situation worse, not better?
The question is, who is the world's leading military power? And the last that I heard, it was not a two-bit Saudi dictatorship. It was the United States of America. We have got to make the decision as to what happens in the war in Yemen and our role in that. And that's what the vote today is about.
Do you think you have the votes?
Yeah, I think we have. In my discussion with Democrats, we have far more support than we had last time. I'm not quite sure how we're doing with the Republicans, but I know Mike Lee is trying his best to make this a strong bipartisan effort. Thank you very much.
Thanks, sir.
All right, you just heard there from Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. He and Senator Mike Lee of Utah are the co-sponsors of this resolution that you just heard from Senator Sanders. He feels that they, with the help of Senator Lee, are going to be able to muster the required votes necessary to pass this War Resolutions Act, invoking the War Resolutions Act, which is, again, as a reminder, is a law that was passed in 1973 to check the president's ability or power to conduct war without the express authorization of the United States Congress. Up until this moment, the U.S. Congress and the Senate has looked to the U.S.-Saudi alliance as being of greater value than some of the human rights abuses that the Saudis have perpetuated. Now, as you heard from Senator Bernie Sanders, with this war in Yemen that has been raging, thousands of people killed, millions of people that are going to be displaced and die of starvation, there's a real imperative here. Here's Senator Bob Corker, Republican of Tennessee.
Secretary of State Pompeo and Secretary of Defense Mattis provide. Like most in the room, was disappointed that Gina Haspel was not there, but we did appreciate the fact that they were. I tried to express as clearly as I could that we have a problem here. We understand that Saudi Arabia is an ally of sorts and a semi-important country. And we've watched innocent people be killed. We've watched people die of diseases that they shouldn't be dying of, and yet we've continued to not want to cut our nose off to spite our face by doing something that is against our national interest. We also have a crown prince that's out of control, a blockade in Qatar, the arrest of a prime minister in Lebanon, the killing of a journalist. And whether there's a smoking gun, I don't think there's anybody in the room that doesn't believe he was responsible for it. And just as Secretary Pompeo, if somebody at the State Department kills somebody, he's responsible for that. MBS has not taken ownership of the death. Whether he directed it or not, I think he did, but whether he did or not, it's his agency that killed this journalist, and they've taken no ownership of that. The Lee Sanders bill is amendable with 51 votes. So the first vote is only to get on it. Then it can be amended. And what I've asked Secretary of State Pompeo and Secretary Mattis is there something that is appropriate that Congress can do to send the right signal to Saudi Arabia, since thus far the administration has been unwilling to do it. The response by the administration is not in balance, and I think they know that. The response by Saudi Arabia is not in balance. And so the question is, will the administration try to seek that balance in the next hour or two or three? Or will Congress be left to blunt objects to try to respond itself? And I'd much rather see them do it, and do it in the appropriate way that has not been done yet. But short of that, I have laid in the railroad tracks to keep us from doing things that I believe are against our national interests as it relates to Saudi Arabia. But I may now be willing to get on the Lee Sanders vehicle, knowing it can be amended, to figure out some way for us to send the appropriate message to Saudi Arabia that appropriately displays American values and American national interests. So with that, I know Secretary Pompeo is coming. I had a nice conversation with him this morning. I respect him greatly, as I do Mattis. But I think 80% of the people left the hearing this morning not feeling like an appropriate response has been forthcoming.
Senator, why isn't the CIA director here? Do you think that the president's personal financial interest in Saudi Arabia is playing a role in his unwillingness to condemn?
I'm not aware of any financial interest, and I'm not trying to in any way insinuate nefarious reasoning for our lack of appropriate response. But the fact is, there hasn't been an appropriate response yet, and I would much rather see the administration respond appropriately than us in a normal legislative way that ends up not being perfect, responding ourselves, but I think that is what's going to happen unless they do.
Senator, if the administration doesn't take action, does that mean then that you'll support this resolution?
It's very likely that that I will support getting on it. Let me say one more time. That doesn't necessarily mean that I support the substance, because you can amend it with 51 votes. Once you get on the Lee Sanders vehicle, per our conversations with the parliamentarian, you could then amend it with a different type of legislation that speaks to this in a little bit better manner. But it will be the Wild West if we get on it.
So is there a Goldilocks solution then?
I don't know. The Goldilocks solution absolutely is the administration forcing Saudi Arabia to take ownership over what has happened with the journalist, and putting in place appropriate policies relative to what they're doing as it relates to innocent civilians. I've been in favor of us selling precision-guided missiles. I don't want them using dumb bombs and killing additional civilians. I've been supportive of that. I don't want people killed unnecessarily. But at present, there's a disconnect between U.S. policies and values being communicated properly to the world, not just to Saudi Arabia. And as I mentioned, Secretary Pompeo, my friend, who I respect, could address that this afternoon. The President could address it this afternoon or tomorrow, and possibly legislation not be necessary. I'll see.
Why wasn't the CIA director here?
Don't know.
You've been talking to them.
All right. So again, you could just sort of hear the frustration. It's really interesting to hear. Okay, here's Senator Mike Lee of Utah. Let's listen to what he has to say.
I remain convinced that one of the most important components of our Constitution is the separation of powers, that which allocates power between the three respective branches of government. This is an issue that's neither Republican nor Democratic. It's neither liberal nor conservative. It is neither pro-war nor anti-war. It simply tells us, in this particular instance, that when it comes to the most important decision that we can make as lawmakers, that is putting the lives of America's brave men and women in uniform on the line, the executive cannot act by himself. Now, this is a war of bipartisan creation. A Democratic president has gotten us involved in a civil war in Yemen. We now have a Republican president. That war has continued. It was started, and it has continued, without the involvement of the Congress, without the approval of the Congress, without a declaration of war or an authorization for the use of military force by the Congress. That's not okay. When we were involved in fighting a war, here, someone else's civil war, half a world away, in a conflict that no one can explain has any direct connection to the safety of the American homeland, I think it's appropriate for the Congress to have a word in that. Now, the War Powers Act provides us some procedures for asserting our power where the president has gotten us involved in something, or in this case, has continued an effort started by a previous president. That's what we're invoking with the Sanders-Lee resolution, and that's what we expect to vote on in some form or another today. We received a briefing just moments ago. I didn't hear anything in that briefing that changed my mind with regard to our constitutional authority to decide whether or not we go to war. That changed my mind with regard to whether or not this is an appropriate exercise in invoking the War Powers Act. Quite to the contrary, the fact that we heard only conclusory assertions to the contrary, it makes me even more convinced that this is an appropriate exercise of that power. Now, with regard to Mr. Khashoggi, this is an instance in which one man has died, and that's one man who has died compared to many, many, many more who have died in connection with this war. It's brought the eyes of the American people and turned them toward us, and turned them also toward Saudi Arabia. It's also, perhaps more importantly, turned the eyes of the entire world not just on Saudi Arabia, but on us, on how we respond to this. In any event, regardless of what may have happened with Mr. Khashoggi, we are fighting a war in Yemen that we haven't declared, that has never been declared or authorized by Congress. That's not constitutional, and it would be wrong for us to do nothing about it. That's why I'm going to support this resolution. That's why I've co-sponsored it with Senator Bernie Sanders. Now, Bernie Sanders is a progressive independent who caucuses with the Democrats. I don't think I've ever been described with any of those words. He and I disagree on many things, but we agree on this. And we agree on the fact that one of the things that differentiates our system of government from the system of government from which our founding fathers departed and broke off more than 2 centuries ago was that our chief executive cannot enter into war unilaterally. In Federalist 69, James Mattis explained this was an important distinction between the king and the presidency. The king, you see, could get England involved in a war without going to Parliament. That's not true in our system of government, and it should never be.
Do you have the votes for this?
I don't know. We came within 6 votes, I believe, last time. I don't believe that we will lose many, if any, from those that we got a few months ago. I am certain that we will pick up some Democrats, and I'm certain there will also be some Republican defection.
What's your argument to Republicans? Like, how are you convincing Republicans on your side that this is the right move to do? There's been a lot of resistance on the Republican side.
Sure, but there shouldn't be. First of all, we've all sworn an oath to uphold, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Secondly, if you're looking at this from the angle of just being a Republican, first of all, that's wrong when you're facing a constitutional duty. Secondly, even if you are looking at this solely as a partisan issue, this is something you could call President Obama's war. He got us involved in that. So I don't look at it that way. I think it's a constitutional issue. It's a separation of powers issue. But if somebody wants to look at it purely from a Republican angle, that should be it.
Why do you think you have more supporters now than you did last time?
I think, number one, the passage of a few months has allowed people to think about this a little bit more, has allowed people to see the war progressing, continuing to result in a lot of awful casualties, including casualties of a lot of innocent civilians and children. And I think the Khashoggi incident has also gotten a lot of people's attention and has perhaps caused a lot of people to wonder why we should so blindly, so willingly enter into an alliance with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to fight the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. I wish it didn't have to come to that, but that has gotten a lot of people's attention.
Are you open to amendments from your fellow Republicans? Senator Gordon said that might be an option.
I think the important thing for the first procedural vote that might come up is to get it on the floor. And generally speaking, I prefer more debate to less. And generally speaking, I welcome the idea of amendments. I'm aware of nothing that would preclude us from considering amendments once we brought this up. And it's my belief that amendments could pass by a simple majority.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much.
All right. Senator Mike Lee of Utah, he's co-sponsoring this resolution with Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. You heard him especially explaining exactly why they feel that they need to do this, which is the Congress's ability to declare war as deemed by our Constitution. And in this case, a war that was started, as Senator Lee points out, under the administration of Barack Obama is still being prosecuted under the administration of Donald Trump. It's been since 2015. The acts of terror, if you want to call them that, in Yemen have grown worse. There have been reports of bombs being dropped on civilians and women and children by the Saudi and the Saudi-led alliance. And so now you're starting to see a bipartisan effort by senators in the U.S. Senate to check the president. The way to do that is by invoking the War Powers Resolution, which is a 1973 law that allows Congress to check the president's ability to wage war without the express consent of the Congress. And so now what you're seeing is Republicans and Democrats coming to that microphone, and they're expressing frustration in several factors. One, that the CIA Director Gina Haspel was not allowed, because the White House did not allow her to be present at this briefing, from Senator Pompeo and, from Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Mattis. They wanted to hear from her. More and more, you're seeing senators of both parties approaching that microphone and saying that they are now convinced more than ever that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, who one senator described is out of control. I think that was Senator Bob Corker, Republican of Tennessee. Out of control, the senator pointed to numerous things that have happened at his direction before the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, including the blockade of Qatar, the detaining of a member of the Lebanese government, and human rights abuses that up until this moment the U.S. government has been willing to overlook because of this strategic alliance that the United States has had in place with Saudi Arabia for many, many years, predating even 9/11, as a way to combat terrorism. The war that is happening in Yemen, and Senator Lee gave a little bit of a background on it, but really it's a much more complicated subject. It's sort of a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which we do not have time to get into here while we watch this microphone and wait for more senators to approach it. But it is a proxy war that is being fought, and the United States is supplying Saudi Arabia with the weapons that they are using, and now what the United Nations is calling one of the greatest humanitarian disasters of a generation. Millions of people are on the verge of starvation. Millions of people do not have access to clean water or food. Thousands have been killed in the campaign of the war. We are expecting, I'm told in my earpiece, that Secretary Pompeo is going to, there he is. So let's listen to Secretary Pompeo.
Secretary Mattis and myself just had the opportunity to brief all the senators who wanted to hear from us. We talked about U.S. policy in Yemen and U.S. policy with respect to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. We also obviously spoke about the heinous murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and we made clear that they're considering debating a resolution on the Senate floor, which we think is just poorly timed. We are on the cusp of allowing the U.S. envoy Martin Griffiths to, in December, gather the parties together and hopefully get a ceasefire in Yemen, something that we have diplomatically been striving for months, and we think we're right on the cusp of that. And so it is the view of the administration, Secretary Mattis and myself, that passing a resolution at this point undermines that. It would encourage the Houthis, it would encourage the Iranians, it would undermine the fragile agreement for everyone to go to Sweden and have this discussion. So we hope that they'll consider that, be thoughtful in how they proceed, and we're happy to give them further information if they should so choose.
Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Pompeo. CIA director, why wasn't the current CIA director here briefing senators as well?
I was asked to be here, and here I am.
But senators were very frustrated. Normally, in your past role as CIA director, you would be here briefing these senators on an issue this sensitive. Why isn't the CIA director herself here today?
I was asked to be here, and I'm here.
You've seen all the intelligence, presumably. Do you believe that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia ordered Jamal Khashoggi's killing?
I do believe. I've read every piece of intelligence, unless it's come in the last few hours. I think I've read it all. There is no direct reporting connecting the Crown Prince to the order to murder Jamal Khashoggi. And that's all I can say in an unclassified setting.
Mr. Secretary, is he responsible?
Yes, ma'am. I don't have anything to add on the sequence of events in North Korea. But I'm very hopeful we will have senior level meetings before too long.
Is MBS responsible?
You say you're on the precipice of a deal.
I didn't say a deal.
A
of
peace
the
agreement.
first opportunity for them to get together.
All
yes.
of Trump's public statements indicate that Iran is very far from coming to the table for negotiations. How do you rectify the two? Which is true.
Well, the parties that will be there will be those who are engaged in the civil war in Yemen. So there'll be representatives from the Yemeni government, from the Houthis, all those interested parties. We hope the Iranians won't upset the apple cart. They have been funding, arming, providing assistance and support to the Houthis, which have allowed the Houthis to continue to fight well beyond what would have made any sense at all. And we do hope the Iranians won't upset this opportunity to both resolve the civil war and give everyone the opportunity to resolve a massive humanitarian crisis that's in Yemen today.
Thank you all very much.
All right, the Secretary of State there, Mike Pompeo, speaking to reporters briefly after he, and along with Secretary James Mattis, briefed all 100 United States senators on what is happening in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The United States Senate is debating whether or not that they will invoke the War Powers Resolution, which is a 1973 law that checks the ability of the United States president to conduct war without authorization from Congress. You've heard over the last 45 minutes or so, every senator, Republican and Democrat, who approached that microphone suggesting that they are now sick and tired of turning a blind eye to Saudi Arabia's past transgressions, even if President Trump himself is still sticking by the Saudi leader, specifically MBS. Just as recently as yesterday, the president, again, suggesting that MBS has denied having a hand in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. You heard all of those senators, Republicans and Democrats, approaching that microphone saying they have a very different view. Many senators went on the record saying they are convinced more than ever that Mohammed bin Salman is responsible directly for the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who in his previous capacity was CIA director, was asked specifically, would he have been present in a meeting like this in his capacity as CIA director? Let's also remember that Secretary Pompeo was before this a politician. He answered like a true politician. He was asked to be here at the meeting, would not comment on whether or not he would have taken part in the briefing of these senators were he still CIA director. But what he did say about what the senators are debating, doing today or possibly tomorrow on the floor of the United States Senate, he called it poorly timed. He says that there is a real chance of bringing the leaders who are fighting this civil war in Yemen, the Saudis, the Houthi-backed rebels, to the table with a ceasefire negotiation. He says it's a very delicate period, that he hopes that he will be able to get it done. But you heard from almost every senator, in fact, every senator who approached that microphone, they are tired. They are tired of the abuses that Saudi Arabia has perpetrated on people in Yemen and in other instances, and the United States has turned a blind eye to because of the strategic alliance that, let's face it, is very important to this country. The Saudis have been helpful in fighting the war on terror, but they've also been accused of numerous human rights violations. And because of the alliance that we've had with that country, because of the arms that we sell them and that they buy, we've been willing to, up to a point, look aside to those human rights transgressions. Well, you heard there from almost every senator that approached that microphone, both Republican and Democrat, they are done doing that. We'll have to see if they actually bring this resolution to the floor of the Senate. We expect that to happen today or possibly tomorrow. We heard today. We'll see if it happens. We've got reporters there on the ground. Nancy Cordes is there. We're going to chat with her throughout the course of the day. Let's take a quick break. You're looking at a live shot of Capitol Hill on a beautiful day in Washington, D.C. This is CBSN, CBS News, always on.